Okay, here's something to think about. When you're reading the Gospels, have you ever noticed only Matthew uses that exact phrase, kingdom of heaven?
Hmm.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What was Matthew getting at that maybe the others framed differently?
That specific detail is actually a perfect starting point for us today. We're going to take a real deep dive into Matthew's gospel. And we've pulled together quite a mix of sources, theological notes, those great Bible Project summaries, some detailed commentary, even discussions from places like Reddit.
Right.
The goal isn't just, a dry summary. We want to get under the skin of Matthew's perspective, figure out what makes it unique and why it's been so influential and, well, why it might still matter to you today.
Absolutely. So whether you're, someone who studies these texts all the time, or maybe you're just curious about where Christian ideas come from,
Yeah.
or even just interested in a book that's undeniably shaped, well, a lot of Western culture, we're aiming for clarity here, trying not to get bogged down in overly technical stuff. Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. Who do we actually think wrote this gospel? And who was the intended audience?
Well, the traditional view, and the Bible Project mentions this, is that the author was Matthew, the tax collector, one of Jesus's inner circle.
Right.
The events themselves are set, broadly speaking, between maybe 10 BCE and 40 CE in the Greco-Roman world. And the writing itself probably happened sometime between 50 and 90 CE.
But this is where it gets interesting. And that Reddit discussion really brought this out. The common view among scholars today is, well, maybe an anonymous author writing later, maybe around 80 or 90 CE.
That's definitely the prevailing scholarly perspective.
They bring up figures like Papias and Irenaeus, right, early church guys. But there's this whole question about whether Matthew first wrote in Hebrew, which Papias seemed to suggest, or in Greek, which is, the language of the actual gospel we have.
It's a key point of debate. And the Reddit thread also highlights something significant about the text itself. It's written in the third person.
Ah, yeah.
Even when it describes the calling of Matthew or Levi, depending on the account it says him, the author isn't writing like, then Jesus called me. It's always him.
Which does make you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If it's not necessarily an eyewitness account from the disciple Matthew, then who was this written for? What was their situation?
Good question. The consensus, really, from the Bible Project and our other notes is that the primary audience was a community of Jewish followers of Jesus. And they were in a really tricky spot.
Tricky how?
Think about it. They're following Jesus, but they're still Jewish. But they're starting to be seen as, well, separate from mainstream Judaism. And then the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed.
A massive event.
Huge.
Yeah.
And that just deepens the split. They're kind of losing their connection to the synagogues, becoming this distinct group. Our notes mention this specifically. They're navigating this division.
Okay, so Matthew's writing is like a guidepost for this specific community in flux. So what's the main message? What's he really trying to hammer home?
Exactly. A guidepost is a good way to put it. His central purpose, as the Bible Project lays out, is to show unequivocally that Jesus is the Messiah promised in the Old Testament.
Right.
He carefully lays out Jesus' lineage back to David, presents him as this new authoritative teacher, like a new Moses.
Okay.
And crucially, as Emmanuel God with us. For his Jewish audience reeling from the temple's loss, this wasn't just history. It was saying, look, Jesus is the fulfillment of our story, not a break from it. It offered continuity, hope.
So it's looking back to connect the dots, but also looking forward, giving them tools for the future.
Precisely. The notes stress that Matthew wanted to provide a solid foundation for them to keep following Jesus, especially as the original apostles, the eyewitnesses, weren't going to be around forever. He's interpreting Jesus, his words, his actions for their specific time, their questions, their anxieties, and he includes some pretty direct warnings, too.
Warnings about what?
Things like, stay united, don't get judgmental, be open to sinners, build a stable community structure, practical advice for survival and faithfulness, really.
Okay, so we've got the author question, the audience, the core purpose. How does he actually structure the gospel to get all this across? What's the flow like?
The Bible Project gives a really clear picture here. You've got an introduction and a conclusion that sort of bookend the whole thing.
Okay.
And in between, there are 5 main sections. And the really distinct thing is that each of these 5 sections ends with a big block of Jesus's teaching.
Oh, interesting. So narrative, then teaching, narrative, then teaching.
Exactly. It creates this rhythm. You get the story, then you pause and reflect on the teaching that comes out of it.
You quickly sketch out those, I think the Bible Project said 7 parts overall.
Sure. It starts with introducing Jesus as Messiah, Emmanuel. Then the kingdom arrives, think Sermon on the Mount. Then you see the kingdom's power in action, miracles, calling disciples, then more teaching, then the journey to Jerusalem, the crucifixion, and finally the resurrection.
And this idea of Jesus as the ultimate teacher keeps popping up in our notes. What's Matthew emphasizing there?
He really positions Jesus as the one who doesn't just follow Moses' law, but perfects it, brings it to its ultimate meaning and purpose.
Not throwing it out, but fulfilling it.
Exactly. And think about the very end, the Great Commission. Jesus tells his followers to go and teach all nations. It reinforces this idea that Jesus' teaching role continues through his followers, empowered by him.
And you can't talk about Matthew without mentioning all those Old Testament quotes, right? It feels very intentional.
Oh, completely intentional. The Bible Project, Crossway articles, they all highlight this. Matthew constantly uses quotes and allusions from the Hebrew scriptures.
I saw many.
He's meticulously showing his Jewish readers Jesus isn't some random new thing. He is the fulfillment of everything you already hold sacred. See? It's all connected. He's building that bridge for them.
Okay, let's circle back to where we started that phrase, kingdom of heaven. Our source from Maranatha Baptist Seminary really digs into this. Why heaven and not God?
Right, it's a classic question about Matthew. The seminary article talks about a couple of main views. Historically, some theologians, particularly early dispensationalists, saw a real theological difference between the two phrases.
A different kingdom altogether.
Sort of, yeah. But the more common view now, even among later dispensationalists and others, is that it's more about connotation, not a totally separate thing. One popular idea is respect.
Respect.
Yeah, that Matthew, writing mainly for Jews who deeply revered God's name, used heaven as a kind of respectful substitute, a circumlocution, to avoid saying God too directly or too often.
That makes sense given the cultural context. But the article mentioned another angle, too, linking it to the Old Testament.
Absolutely, and this is really fascinating. The other idea is that Kingdom of Heaven deliberately points Jewish readers back to the prophecies in the book of Daniel, especially chapters 2 and 7.
Daniel. How so?
Well, those chapters talk about a kingdom coming from the God of heaven that will eventually replace all earthly kingdoms. It's a very specific image of divine intervention and ultimate sovereignty.
So it's not just about not saying God's name. It's actively invoking this specific prophetic hope of a heavenly kingdom breaking into earthly history.
Precisely. Matthew seems to be setting up this contrast. God, the king of heaven, versus earthly rulers like Herod, or even Satan, the ruler of this world.
Right.
And it all leads up to that final declaration by Jesus in the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. It's the culmination of that heavenly authority asserting itself.
Wow. And for that original audience, maybe facing pressure or even persecution from earthly powers, what would that emphasis mean?
The article suggests it would be incredibly powerful. Comforting even. It says, look, even if earthly rulers oppose you, you're on the side of the God of heaven. Your real hope, your real future, isn't in these temporary earthly kingdoms, but in his coming kingdom.
That's a strong message.
Yeah, and the article even points to the earthquakes mentioned only in Matthew at the crucifixion and resurrection as maybe symbolic displays of heaven's power over the earth.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to how Jesus teaches in Matthew. Parables are huge. Enduring Word Commentary calls them earthly stories with a heavenly meaning. What's key to understanding them?
The main thing the commentary stresses is that parables usually drive home one central point. We sometimes get bogged down trying to assign meaning to every little detail, treating them like complex codes.
Like every single character or object is a symbol for something else.
Exactly. But often, Jesus is just telling a relatable story to make a clear spiritual point. They reveal truth to those open to it, but can sometimes, obscure it for those whose hearts are hard.
Okay, let's take a famous one. The parable of the sower in Matthew 13. What's the core message there, according to the commentary?
That parable is all about how different people respond to the message, the word of the kingdom. You've got the four soils, the path, rocky ground, thorny ground, good soil. Each represents a different kind of reception hearts where the word can't penetrate, where it starts but fades under pressure, where it gets choked out by life's worries, and finally where it takes root and bears fruit. The big takeaway is about really hearing, understanding, and letting that word transform you.
And then right after that, in the same chapter, come more parables, wheat and tares, mustard seed, leaven. What connects those?
Enduring word groups these under the idea of the mystery of the kingdom, sometimes interpreted as showing complexities or even potential corruption within the visible kingdom community here on earth.
Corruption. How so?
Well, the wheat and tares clearly show genuine believers and false ones existing side by side until the final judgment. But the mustard seed and leaven, which we often think of purely positively, are sometimes interpreted here as showing an outward growth that might not be entirely pure, or maybe an influence that suddenly changes things in unexpected ways. It's a more complex picture of the kingdom's reality in the present age.
That's interesting. A reminder that interpretation isn't always simple. What about the next two, the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price?
These shift the focus a bit. The commentary sees them as highlighting the incredible value Jesus sees in his people, in the kingdom itself. He is the one who finds this treasure, this pearl, and gives everything to acquire it. It emphasizes the preciousness of the kingdom and those who belong to it in God's eyes.
And then, near the end of our scope here, there's that story of Jesus being rejected in his hometown, Nazareth. What does enduring word say about that?
Yeah, it's a poignant moment. The people who knew him growing up, they're amazed by his wisdom and power, but they just can't get past his ordinary background. Isn't this the carpenter's son?
Familiarity breeds contempt, sort of thing.
Exactly. And Jesus quotes that proverb, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town." And the text explicitly says their unbelief limited the miracles he did there. It really underscores how crucial faith is to experiencing God's work.
So bringing all these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive on Matthew, what are the really crucial takeaways?
I think the big things are realizing Matthew wrote with a very specific purpose for a specific group of people, Jewish followers of Jesus facing huge changes. He's relentlessly showing Jesus as the fulfillment of everything they knew from the Old Testament, the Messiah, the ultimate teacher, inaugurating this kingdom of heaven,
Right.
and the teachings themselves on discipleship, what the kingdom looks like in practice, how we need to actually receive the message. Those are still incredibly relevant for us today, aren't they?
Definitely. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Knowing what we discussed, the historical backdrop, the intended audience, the debates around authorship, how does that change how you read Matthew? Does understanding its original context shift your perspective on its message for today?
Mm.
Or maybe think about that contrast Matthew draws, the kingdom of heaven versus the kingdoms of this earth. How does that tension play out in your own life, in your faith, and how you see the world around you? Something to definitely keep thinking about.